Now we're doing it.
Thank you. So yes, all of you, if you have like any issues with it being recorded, you can let us know because we will upload it also to YouTube. So yes, you can let us know if you don't want your part to be there. Yeah. Okay. And so now for Mattia, he is a doctoral researcher in the research group Narrative, Culture, and Cognition of our university here in Tartu. He's also part of the management committees of the European. I'm sorry, I don't understand that. Anyway, he's very active in the academic world. Yes. And he has an MA in modern philology from the University of Milan. His background includes experience in business management and web design, and he has previously engaged in research topics such as storytelling for video games, human-computer interaction, and procedural content generation via machine learning. And now at Tartu, he's focusing on complexity, interactive storytelling, and narratology in video games. And yeah, this is a little bit also what he will be talking to us about. So yes, I'm sorry for that. Maybe Mattia, you can explain. And yeah, I leave you, please.
Thank you, Israel, and absolutely no problem. Actually, I'm going to show anyway the European network, which is it's a European cost action I'm part of, and I'm going to invite also the interested in joining. So no problem about it, absolutely. But actually, thank you for organizing this, for inviting me here, and I hope I will be able to keep up the quality of this series. But okay, so should we get started?
Yes.
Okay. So can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So again, hello everybody, thank you for being here. Today I'm going to talk briefly about the use of interactive digital narratives to represent the complexity of cultural heritage. But probably before getting started to the real serious topic, I would need to introduce slightly what are interactive digital narratives, and I'm going to call them IDNs from now on, probably. So I think in a very, very basic sense, they are narratives presented through a digital medium that afford users interaction with the overall story of a narrative and or of its discourse. So they can basically be interactive movies, interactive documentaries, or interactive journal articles. But please note that an article with links in an online journal is not an IDN, because they do not afford interaction with the narrative and nor with the discourse. But on the other hand, video games, you might think that video games are indeed interactive digital narratives, but I think that the proportion is not really one-on-one. I think video games can incorporate an IDN, but they can also be interactive digital artifacts without a narrative, like I'm thinking of Pac-Man, for example, or even without an interactive narrative like Super Mario Bros. So IDNs have some peculiar properties that I think are worth mentioning briefly, so that we are all on the same place when we will be progressing. And the 4 properties of interactive digital narratives are directly are defined by Murray as properties of digital media in general, and have been applied by Koenitz later to IDNs in particular. And they are the procedural, the procedurality, their participatory nature, their spatiality, and the encyclopedic capacity they afford. So to explain those four very briefly, I will take some examples from digital media at large for the sake of clarity and of more clear examples. And I will also try to explain what they mean specifically for IDNs. So the procedurality can be defined, it means that IDNs or digital media can be defined by a system of rules which determine the state of the artifact at each moment, which means that states are not defined directly by the author, but they are defined indirectly through rules. So for example, health of a character in a video game is not defined at each moment by the game developers themselves, but it's controlled by a system of rules. If you get hit, you lose a heart. But also, even in more static artifacts like interactive movies, I think you might know Bandersnatch, the story is not so, okay, the story is set in stone by the authors, but the current state of the story is defined by rules. And as soon as interactivity kicks in, you can't say anymore in minute 56, if the movie is saying so, or the story is at this point. Okay, so I use Bandersnatch because it's a famous example, but it's meant to problematize with the very concept of interactivity, so handle with care. But the participatory property means that they are responsive to our input, which in turn means that we do have an impact on the artifact itself. So very simply, if I press a button, Super Mario jumps. But also, if I tell an IDN what I want to do, it tells me what happens in response. So for example, here, I think this is Colossal Cave Adventure. I can explore the space by typing where I want the fictional character to go. And I think interactivity comes from the interplay of procedurality and the participatory property, because rules define how the artifact responds to my inputs, and rules define the current state of the artifact itself, depending on the input through the rules. So they are both necessary for interactivity. So the spatial property means that digital artifacts can represent navigable space. And of course, the clearer example of this is video games, that we have sometimes very large maps, very large and very detailed maps. So we can visit them, we can look for places, we can go all around buildings and so on. And so as defined by Murray, so Murray says that digital artifacts have this capacity of being spatial. And she said that linear media such as books and films can portray space, either by verbal description or image, but only digital environments can present space that we can move through. So they make the space accessible, I would say, with varying degrees of afforded freedom. But this one, probably more than on property, at least for IDNs, it's an afforded possibility. And actually, on a side note, I should say, an increasingly expected feature, because spatiality is not always there in very strong degree in IDNs. But okay, so just keep this in mind. And lastly, the encyclopedic capacity is the capacity to represent enormous quantities of information. And well, it's pretty relatively common to find extremely dense game words, for example, where there are a lot of information scattered throughout an extremely big game word. And I think in digital form, this translates into an artist's potential to offer a wealth of detail, so to represent the word in both in scope and in particularity. And Murray says that just as important as this huge capacity is the encyclopedic expectation they induce. So people tend to expect a certain quantity of information. And so all of these together, and I'm citing kernels here, means that IDN can use the ability of the computer to hold practically limitless amounts of data while enabling the audience to influence the progression and the outcome of narrative experiences. Audiences as participants can see the effects of the decisions and revisit them through replay. And interactors can choose between different viewpoints and in principle even adding their own ideas and discuss them with others, all within the same artifact. So taking together these four aspects describe the potential of IDN for enhanced representation of complex topics. And today, what I want to show you, apart from indeed this, that this is actually true, is how they can represent the complex topic that is culture. So culture comes from numerous elements and complex relationships between them. I think the Oxford Encyclopedia Dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary counts, for example, ideas, customs, social behaviors, products, way of life, and so on, among what generates or where culture can be found. And I think all of these are mixed together in a multifaceted whole that is sometimes difficult to disentangle in a linear form. And I think exactly for this reason, scholars are now looking into IDNs specifically for representing such complex topics. So again, I will try to explain you what is IDN's potential in this regard, but also I will try to show you some necessary drawbacks. So I will try to show you how IDNs can be used to create a complex fictional culture first, and then how they can represent an even more complex real cultural heritage, in both doing them in a way that helps us understanding it. So as you might have read from my abstract, as an example of a fictional culture, I'm going to talk about the Elder Scrolls, the fifth installments of the Elder Scrolls series, which is Skyrim. So very briefly, what's the game about? It's about the player's character on its quest to defeat a dragon who is prophesied to destroy the world. So it's put in this sense, or in this way, it's a very simple story, but this is an extreme simplification because the game has an impressive narrative apparatus. Consider that let's say an average game has about 25-30 hours of playtime. This game has around 500 hours of playtime. But also to make it easier understandable, maybe specifically for the narrative, consider that the whole trilogy of the Lord of the Rings has about a bit more than 500,000 words in total. So the 3 books. In Skyrim, there are around 1 million words, both in text and in dialogue lines, so almost double. So the game is set in a region, in the region of Skyrim, which is the white one up here, the very north part of the continent. It has a mountainous landscape, and it's now under the control of the Empire. And the leaders of the Empire are a race of high, dark-skinned elves, which from their predominant position are trying to impose their own culture to all conquered peoples. And among them are the North, which are the inhabitants of the region of Skyrim. However, the North have a strong cultural background, which is not very well aligned with the imperial view. And these clashes keep the region in a constant fear of civil war. So already from this very short synopsis, I think, you can foresee that the story world of Skyrim is quite culturally heavy. And indeed, I think that we can safely talk about cultural design for this game. And I think this is not the case for many other games. And I think it also explains why I decided to talk specifically about this one. And the creation of the well, the creation and de-representation of the cultural apparatus here is done through a number of elements. So the first of all, as I said, are the two factions that are on the edge of a war due to cultural incompatibilities. And in particular, I think the overarching main cultural incompatibility is due to religious beliefs. The North worship a human, but the elves banned this worshipping because humans are not worth worshipping, basically. Well, of course, the real reason for the war are rather complex, as one could expect, and include economy and power struggle and so on. But the worship of Talos, which is this human god, is at least the casus belli. But also there are some areas of Skyrim that are allied with one of the other faction, and depending also on how much the cult of this human god is felt important, the siding is kind of decided. And I think in exploring the world, players can get to know both points of view, and they can decide by themselves with which faction to side. I think they also have the opportunity to see the reasons and the two cultures from inside the armies. So basically, they can have a first-hand experience of both cultures, both actually as foreigners. So they are not statingly part of one or the other culture. But also there are a number of races with their very own beliefs and cultures, which rend Skyrim actually also a land full of racism. And there are a number of smaller scale story arcs that deal with deities. And actually even the player, well, or at least the player character is a mythological entity in a way. It's kind of similar to the Christian savior who could cleanse the world from the danger of dragons, something like that. But so again, players do feel part of the culture. So even if from an external position, they are part of the legends that are being told in the game. There are also smaller storylines that deal with guilds and particular customs, like some are hierarchical, some are treat everyone as peers and things like that. But I would say all these four elements or all these four techniques could be seen as coming out of a partly unintentional, or okay, so the diversification itself could be partly unintentional. It could be due to diversification for world building, because the game world of Skyrim is about 42 square kilometers, and having 42 square kilometers made of hundreds of places all the same is of course boring. But I think this is not the case, particularly because there are about 820 pieces of readable literature. So there is an immense in-game literature explaining history, legends, custom beliefs of both factions, or both the North and the Imperial guys. But there are also like fictional novels, children's stories, game books, and stuff like that, that even though they are not showing directly the culture, they are building the culture of one or the other faction by the very same means that we build our own cultures. And I think one should also remember that this game, so Skyrim, is the 5th major game of a series. And indeed, there is also one other aspect that is being used to build this fictional culture, this heavy fictional cultural apparatus, which is the culture of the player himself or herself. Because culture is in a way itself participatory. Part of the stories that are building the mythology of Skyrim are actually stories of previous installments of the series. And therefore, if so it could be perceived by the player of Skyrim as mythology, but actually it is history. So this is also kind of related with what Roland Barthes claimed about myth, that mythology can only have an historical foundation. So if players are, so to say, accultured in the Elder Scrolls series, they can partly rely on this knowledge to understand the culture of the North and the struggle for power presented in the game. However, even more than that, I think knowledgeable players can feel as if they participated in actually building such cultural apparatus. And I think the clearer example is this one. So the book, this book here, it's inside Skyrim. If you notice, there are interactive interaction, explanation of the interaction mechanism here. So this book can be, you can turn the pages of the book here. So this book, the Oblivion Crisis, is actually a report of what players played in the previous game, which unsurprisingly was called Oblivion. And there are in the book even some blank spots where the narrator says things like, so this was not reported, but the pieces of this recalling or of this report that are not reported are actually filled by players' knowledge, because the players who played the previous game know what happened because they were making it happen. And there are plenty of other examples, both from Oblivion, so like this one on Oblivion, which is a bestiary and a recalling of places that are in Oblivion. Again, players encountered them firsthand during the previous game. And also from the whole series at large. So this A Short Life of Uriel Septim VII is recalling of the events of the life of this emperor, which is one of the main characters of many previous games of the Elder Scrolls series. But also this Brief History of the Empire Part 4. I think there are 12 chapters of this History of the Empire. So all of these have been played in some regards by knowledgeable players or a fan of the series. And therefore, we can find a hardly precedented phenomenon here, which is to observe the evolution of cultures with the passage of time. And somehow, because this kind of cultural myth or myth part of the culture have been played. Players were there when these were written. So they can see how these evolved through the passage of time and somehow trace it as a consequence of a number of factors like power struggle, economic and social reasons, and so on. And I think piecing all this information together is an effort that has been done in incredibly high details by fans. But I think exactly this phenomenon of piecing everything together, or the possibility of piecing everything together, should show us an important caveat, which is probably hardly visible here due to the very fact of dealing with a fictional cultural heritage. And a fictional culture that is very well accessible to players exactly for these design choices, because designers wanted things to make sense one with the others. And also players wanted or want them to make sense. They want to piece things together. And even if something was maybe thought of not piecing exactly together, at some point, I'm thinking about other games here, but at some point, developers needed to make them in a way coherent, so clear, basically. For example, I think there were many hints to many unclear passages of let's say the cultural apparatus, even though I'm not sure we can define it like that in GTA 5. but at some point, the developers needed to clarify many of those points because people started to get angry because they were disseminating many unclear information. The developers were disseminating many unclear information, and people wanted to piece them together. At some point, they wanted to see if their reconstructions were true or not, basically. So all of this to say that the caveat is that there is a relatively very limited uncertainty of this fictional culture, of the fictional culture in Skyrim. But this is mostly unrealistic, basically. In real life, cultural heritage is much less clear. And I think Jonathan Barbara is trying to show us exactly this. And he's trying to do so through the hypogeum. So I'm not reading the full name here because I know there might be some Maltese friends, and I know I will mess up with the pronunciation. So if later some Maltese are here, they can pronounce it correctly. I will call just the hypogeum for now. And I think the hypogeum itself is a perfect example of the complexity of cultural heritage. As Jonathan says, the hypogeum example presents a scenario where a site, its artifacts, burial processes, ceremonies, the other contemporary temples in Malta, the passage of time, the excavation, the reporting, and the modern day interpretations are all intertwined elements, where the consideration of one supports or contradicts that of another in a systemic exchange of meaning that further suggests an objective complex phenomenon. And this is also the reason why I chose this particular example to talk about the representation of a real cultural heritage, because again, it's a perfect example of the complexity of cultures. But first of all, I think I need to tell you what the hypogeum is. So the hypogeum is an underground Neolithic construction, well, actually excavation. It was built over the time of around 2 millennia, between something like 6,000 and 4,000 years ago. And it presents now a number of interconnected chambers on 3 underground levels. Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell, it's in Malta. That's why I was talking about Maltese. So I think this one, if you might have seen this, it's the most famous chamber of the hypogeum. And the hypogeum itself is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and its access is restricted because there's an internal delicate microclimate that helps its preservation. And what Jonathan Barbara is doing with it, he's trying to digitalize it, or actually he already digitalized it. And the digitalized hypogeum is now a virtual reality experience that is based on on 3D scans of the real site. And this digitalized version well, it's meant to allow easier access to an otherwise, again, restricted site, which is very, very difficult to visit otherwise. But also to foster interests in its cultural value for the general public, but in particular for younger generation that is particularly interested in this kind of augmented and virtual reality experiences, and also for experimental archaeologists that have kind of something more malleable to work with than the real site. And I think I encourage you to view the video on YouTube, which Jonathan made available a few months ago. And I think this is probably the most accessible version of this artifact at the current stage. And it gives you an idea both of the place and of the great work done so far. It's easy to find. You need to search hypogeum virtual reality, but I can share the links in the chat later. And I think I have it also in my references, so you can find it also there. But what I wanted to say about it is that the Maltese team is now working on a perfected version of the digitalized hypogeum for VR gears. And a major feature they want to further develop is a broader and more expanded IDN inside this digitalized version of the site. And through this IDN, it would be possible to represent and also to reduce the complexity of this important piece of world cultural heritage. Before explaining you why it is so, I will show you a very brief example, which I think could clarify better than explaining by voice. So this is an ancient artifact found inside the Hypogeum, actually at the bottom of a pit, if I'm not wrong. And there are a number of theories trying to explain what this one represents, but I think telling all of them in a linear form could be confusing. And instead I prepared a very simple IDN, very simple, which I think tried to encapsulate them. And I think this is in order to present these possible interpretations in a more understandable way. But please do not judge the quality of the story itself. It's not the best story. It's not the perfect IDN, and neither probably the most accurate recollection of the possible hypotheses. But rather look at the mechanisms that I'm trying to highlight with it. So just a second. Okay, can you see it? Oh, sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
Okay, so Israel, please stay close to the mic. So you just found this lady statue in the depths of the Hypogeum, and someone asks you what it is representing. Israel, it seems to you that she's dead or she's sleeping?
Sleeping.
Okay. So she seems to be sleeping, you say. Then the person asks, what was the function of the Hypogeum then? Was a burial ground or a temple for oniromancy, which is the divination of dreams?
A divination of dreams, yeah.
Okay, so you say it's probably a sleeping lady, and therefore the Hypogeum was probably a temple for oniromancy, the divination of dreams. Then the statue could have been used as a sort of, I don't know, magic amulet, and the bunks on this side of the chambers were for people sleeping. So are then the drawings on the ceiling of the Hypogeum meant to invoke images and dreams with the, I don't know, kaleidoscopic effect they could have produced at the light of flames? Well, this is, I think, one of the possible interpretations. But if we hit restart and we say, so now, should we see maybe what if she's actually dead instead? Then the Hypogeum could have been a burial ground, maybe. So the Hypogeum was probably a burial ground, and the lady is dead. So people were buried, and the statue could have been a memento of a specific person or a generic object of prayer. The bunks were then burial chambers, and the drawings on the ceiling maybe represent the tree of life, meaning maybe that these people believed in reincarnation. But of course, she could be dead, and the Hypogeum could be still a temple for oniromancy. People could have been going there to have their future foreseen. They were maybe exposed to some specific substances, maybe, I don't know, psychoactive substances, or their smoke, and the dreams were then interpreted by oracles. But maybe since this lady is still dead, the Hypogeum was used differently in two different times of its 2 millennia long history. And of course, there is also the fourth possibility that she is sleeping, but the Hypogeum is actually a burial ground. And so maybe the lady could have been a sort of amulet for the dead to assist them in their trespassing, meaning that they would eventually awaken in this world or another, So they could have been following a religion which was kind of envisioning multiple lives. But so again, this is an extremely simple IDN, but I hope you also notice the number of conflicting hypotheses surrounding specifically this statue, which is called, I need to tell you, the sleeping lady. But all of these hypotheses are being accounted. So it's not that because it's a sleeping lady, then we are sure that it is a sleeping lady. So these conflicting hypotheses in turn cast some lights on the possible usages of the hypogeum itself, as we have seen, and actually vice versa. So in addition to this one, to these conflicting views we could see, I think we could also explore different hypotheses through replay, so through hitting restart, and therefore we could introduce multiple perspectives over specifically this piece of cultural heritage, very small piece of cultural heritage actually. And I think the same effect would have been significantly toned down if I was presenting you these four possibilities in a linear form, like explaining in a presentation slide or something like that as possible alternatives. Okay, so I would say maybe I agree if you don't really believe this for just this small example of like four hypotheses, but you need to consider that these are just two possible interpretations of the statue and of the hypogeum, therefore, and the more are added, and there is a huge quantity, getting even to alien inhabitants, of course, but aliens are everywhere in history. So the more alternative interpretations, the exponentially more difficulty in accounting them in unilinear forms. And of course, on the contrary, the more useful are IDNs. So I think through procedurality and participation, we were interacting with the artifact and we were directing our very own understanding of it while being exposed in a pretty understandable way to a whole lot of information. And I think in the digitalized hypogeum, so in the expected or at least wished final version of the hypogeum, of the digitalized hypogeum, people could even walk around the place to better inspect the ceilings and the drawings on the ceilings and the bunks, and they could even form or they could even have a better informed understanding of the multifaceted nature of the hypogeum and of this small statue. Of course, once we have a certain explanation, it could be very easily and probably also better explained in a history book. We could have like this big paragraph explaining the function of this statue, well, the small statue, and the function of the hypogeum, and that's it. So we could say the sleeping lady is actually a pregnant woman, and the hypogeum was a fertility temple. That's why the tree of life on the ceiling, and done. Okay, this is the explanation. But I think until there will be uncertainties around something, a unilinear narrative would be an artificial construction, a product of a much more stronger position of an author. And I think we are seeing almost on a daily basis that more and more uncertainties are sprouting even out of well-established historical reconstructions. And I would say also out of scientific understanding, well-established scientific understandings. So I think IDNs are in a way necessary to account these uncertainties and the complexity they give rise to. But on a more theoretical note, so scholars tend to think that the increase in understanding of this multi-perspectivity in IDN is due to their hermeneutic modes. So according to Carolatti's theory, when we interact with an IDN, so while interpreting the current narrative, we tend to evaluate all possible alternatives we have, so that the hermeneutic is a cycle of evaluation and interpretation. However, according to Noller, our understanding is more informed at each revolution, so that our hermeneutic mode is in IDNs is not exactly a circle, but rather it is a spiral, where the theoretically reachable center is a complete understanding of the IDN system. And what I think Noller's model affords us is to explain how we make sense of the multifaceted view. So what you have now in mind after just this 4 very synthetic explanation of possible interpretations of the sleeping lady is not just a better informed view on the hypogeo, but also the understanding that you are inside the hermeneutic spiral, trying to understand the complex topic hypogeo. You see that there are specific interaction modes that produce certain narrative outcomes, but you know that you could inspect them also in advance before going there, so that you already make hypotheses, and therefore you are already accounting for a complex phenomenon. And I think you get to know that there is a whole lot to understand. And I think when we hit replay, we were moving inward in the hermeneutic spiral, so that we had some further understanding of the matter at issue, and we could do better predictions, and then we could see what happened with those predictions, and we could have our own understanding more informed, and so on, in a circle, but actually in a spiral. And what is, I think, particularly surprising is that all of this understanding required you very limited cognitive power to be processed. And I think this is the main real usefulness of IDNs. So to wrap it up, what are the pros and cons of IDNs? So for fictional cultures, I think the pros are that it is relatively easy, even though time-consuming and of course pretty expensive, to design and represent complex structures, cultures in great details. And it is also easy to give an idea of the evolution and changes of the time of cultures to a number of inferences. But of course, the results of this freedom of design are often somehow unrealistic in the level of details, because uncertainty could be somehow problematic to embed. On the other hand, for a real cultural heritage, IDNs can represent a number of even conflicting views without being dispersive or incoherent. They can be useful in protecting sites and generate interest in the public. And they can also, and I think more importantly, enhance the understanding of complex topics, such as cultural heritage. But on the other hand, you have no design freedom in designing IDNs for real cultural heritage, because basically everything is already there, and we might just not knowing it. And because of this specifically, and since each choice of the designer informs the reading of the artifact and the understanding of the portrayed culture, designing the IDN representing a real cultural heritage could be still very difficult. So concluding, I think I would just say that even with some drawbacks, IDNs are powerful tools to make accessible complex topics and overall to address complexity as a societal challenge. So thank you. Please stay in touch. We will have a course on cognitive humanities next semester at the University of Tartu, where we will be dealing with a similar topic, not exactly the same, but we will be using the same cognitive perspective over a number of phenomenon and media and throughout the whole span of the humanities. If you are not interested in the course itself, you can get in touch with the research group on narrative culture and cognition. Here is the website as well. If you're interested in the work of Jonathan, please get in touch with him. He's a very nice guy. And if you're interested in complexity representation, interactive digital narratives, video games, or related topics, please get in touch with INTCORE. So these are my main references, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you indeed. And yes, so let's let's go to the people in Olomouc. Yes, please speak up. And hi to everybody.
Hi.
Hey,
Hello.
could you give a word to the connection to the series theme?
Yes, so actually, when I was looking at the theme in order to find the most suitable topic for the presentation, I was kind of intrigued, specifically by Bart's claim about how mythology is somehow linked to history, and I was thinking about how mythology and history are somehow related in a way, and in the ways this relation is not always clear, and how it can be clear probably only when the relation itself is fictional. Therefore, I was thinking about how these two so distant but yet so in a way similar representation of the same ideas, of the same topics were represented in fiction and in reality, and yeah, and that's it, I guess.
Not bad. That's all we got.
Okay. I saw a lot of other hands that were raised, but I don't know if they were virtual clapping or you actually wanted to say something. But yeah, please, more questions. Yes, we are doing questions now, Jonathan.
Hey Israel, can you
yes, please,
hear
Anna.
me? I have a question. So yeah, your presentation was great. I'm also like a passionate video game player, both PlayStation and PC. And I was thinking, like, I used to play games like that, like the games you described with mythology and everything. So I want to know today's games, like the children play on computers, the cell phones, like those short games. Like how can you define culture of those games today? Like what has changed drastically according to your point of view, according to your opinion, and you are like how did culture in games change drastically suddenly from all those epic and great games to all those simple and stupid games?
So I would say, first of all, I would not I'm not sure if the so I don't know exactly which children games you are
well, in general,
referencing.
those lane games on mobile phones, like which are either guessing something or punching something, or you know, like those situation games, which are, I don't know, like I think everything is lost in those games, every meaning, because when you play a game like epic game, like you get so excited, you get into that character, you like can't sleep at night because you're wondering how will you pass that level. I mean, I've spent sleepless nights playing games, so I know what I'm talking about.
Yes, so I think there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, I would say that Skyrim was not exactly made to have as a target audience children, so it's a more complex game because of its audience of the audience it was referring to. Second of all, mobile gaming has completely different rules and expectations and design customs, because when you're playing on mobile, designers are envisioning that you have between 5 and 15 minutes of playtime, so you can have only very short interactions, which means that everything should be much quicker and therefore you will have much less time to think about stuff, and therefore stuff cannot be as complex as in stationary play or stationary games. And the third reason, I think, is because of games themselves, because there have always been games where, let's say, mindless interactivity was involved, like, I don't know, Pac-Man or Asteroid or Pong. You were just casual games, how we would call them. Yes, exactly, David. I totally agree. There are indeed many, many more simple games than there used to be. But epic games are still indeed being made. We have seen some of them even coming out this year. So in the meantime, I want to thank everyone for answering some of the questions that have been put in, well, for asking questions and for answering them. So thanks, Jonathan, for linking your own video. Thanks, Christian, for the more examples, and everyone. I think David.
We have.
I know Jonathan. Yes.
But wait, because we also had one question from David and one question from Ivan.
Yeah, I think Jonathan Griffin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, had a question earlier, well, before David and...
Okay, let's go Jonathan Griffin, then Ivan. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm okay with waiting. I really don't care.
Okay. No, but go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess I mean, I also really enjoyed this presentation, partly, I mean, because I mean, my actual PhD was in video games. Don't tell anybody. But yeah, I guess what I'll do is I'll just phrase my thoughts instead of trying to convert them into a question, and then let you respond. You know, whatever it brings to mind, or whatever it stirs up, or what have you.
Was there?
I guess what I was thinking about in terms of you know, the story possibilities here, and the expression of different ways of thinking and cultural standpoints and so forth. You know, you're talking a lot about procedural generation as well. I mean, or you're talking about procedural story development and so forth, but also just the mechanic in general is used in video games for a number of reasons. And I guess the first thought I'm having is the results for your story possibilities or your richness or whatever kind of vary depending on where you place your procedural mechanics. Like, I mean, for instance, like Skyrim and all the Elder Scrolls games employ some procedural generation, but where it's put in terms of what it's used to generate leads to different levels of richness. So like, obviously Skyrim and Oblivion too, I'm sure they all different areas, Daggerfall, the whole thing, but use like procedural generation to fill in the grass and trees and things like that, things that don't need to be handcrafted because nobody's going to notice that this individual piece of grass looks like that one. And so you don't really notice because the things that have a lot of like narrative weight are handcrafted, and that's what gives you your sense of immersion. Whereas like a lot of Ubisoft games end up feeling like checklists. But I mean, something that's really, I think, really interesting to think about is the difference between why people are drawn into Elder Scrolls and as opposed to why people are drawn into No Man's Sky, which for a lot of people like ended up feeling like it was empty because the procedural generation was used to craft the bulk of the content. So I think that's an interesting thing to look into, is how, like, what are the narrative possibilities for procedural generation depending on, or not just in terms of graphical things, but in terms of story possibility based on where you put the mechanic. And the other thing I was thinking about that this actually does have a question as a part of it, is I was thinking a lot immediately about the Dark Souls games. I'm not sure if you played those or Bloodborne or anything, but they're notorious for having this very open lore structure, which allows for a lot of filling in of your own narrative. There's a lot of depth and richness that's there, but it's put together in such a way that allows for a lot of different vectors, and depending on your worldview, your background, your perspective, and your cultural stance and everything, you could fill those gaps in ways that would render coherent narrative without being a really forced perspective. And the interesting mechanic is that the main guy behind those games, Miyazaki, based his approach to narrative on when he was growing up in Japan. He was poor, and he got his entertainment. He would go to the library, and he was very much interested in Western fantasy. So he would check out books from the library, but his English was only good enough to understand about half of what he read. So he would fill in the rest with his own imagination and kind of create the story through the skeletal structure that he had. And so he would use that same kind of approach to craft the narrative of his game, or of those games, from Demon Souls to Bloodborne and so forth. And this allows for a lot of things. Like, I mean, when I play those games, I have a Christian perspective, and so like it looks completely coherent to come at it from that angle, but it looks coherent for people to come at it from a different angle. And it's not because it's anemic or because it's procedural in a sense. It's open in a certain way. So that's what I'm thinking about, is like the approach you have here. I wonder if you've applied it there with its focus on like what this approach leaves in possibilities for how it opens things and how it like closes it off because it's not determined. There's a kind of anemia that can come out of it depending on where you put it. So yeah.
So I'll start from the last one. So yes, I think the narrative mode of Souls-like is indeed very interesting. And I think it's also another good example of how we could represent some, or at least tell a story, keeping the uncertainty that is that sprouts exactly from the scattering of information through all over the game world. On the other hand, of course, a lot of this interpretation is left to the players, and this is, I think, also part of the fortune or of the popularity of these games, because players construct their own understood narratives, and they go around telling them in forum and so on, and they discuss it, and so it sparks more discussion and so on. I would say it's a very clever example, or a very good example for explaining how much of what we read, what we try to make sense of, it's always kind of partly unclear in a way. Yes, of course, David is saying this sort of openness to interpretation feels like it might be a risk of using IDNs to represent complex topics. Sometimes you don't want people to fill in the gaps using their imagination. I totally agree with this, but there are also ways to make arguments in IDNs that do not leave space to interpretation. So I think it's just a matter of knowing how to do that, I think. And thanks one more time, David, because you also helped me reply to the part on procedurality. Indeed, Skyrim is using procedural generation also to generate very small story arcs or side quests. But narrative, procedural generation of narrative, I think it's not a thing yet. We can adapt, maybe we can change slightly, or maybe possibly even a lot narratives on the basis of procedural generation. But I don't think we are yet to the point where we can create believable and coherent narratives through procedural generation. I think David could be the one telling you more about this, actually, because he is probably more than me, or for longer than me, for sure, in procedural generation of narrative. So.
Okay, so let's go quickly to Ivan and then David, and let's try to keep it sort of short so we don't, yeah.
Okay, I'll try to make it short. Well, my question is actually about how you understand, how you define cultural heritage, because actually from how you said that when we represent actual heritage, our design choices are kind of limited, or there is no freedom. So basically and the whole presentation seems to be problematic for me in terms of two assumptions about what is cultural heritage. One is that cultural heritage kind of this material stuff we want to represent. And the second is that there's some distance between this heritage and us. And I think that is not always the case. Well, let's take this example of this world tree that is depicted there. So yeah, we can just show how this tree looks, but we can also try to kind of digitally reconstruct how those people imagined that tree. And in that sense, our design choices won't be that limited. And maybe this will be the actual reconstruction of the cultural heritage, not just the representation of the form of it. And the second is, for example, cultural heritage doesn't have to be material at all, or like folklore is also cultural heritage. So, and in that sense, it's still open for interpretation. So we can have like folklore songs from ages, and they are still open for interpretation. We can still try to represent them in different ways and interpret them. So does your approach take into account this immaterial aspect of cultural heritage?
Yes, I think that's an important point indeed. Of course, cultural heritage is not always, and it's never completely physical or tangible or in a way like that. But actually, I was talking about representations of cultural heritage, and representations of cultural heritage need to be kind of tangible in a way, or intangible, but in a sensorially available way. So of course, we could represent how they were seeing the tree of life in the hypogeum, but we need to represent it in some way, and I think this way could be IDNs, because it's kind of easier. It's not maybe the best. I'm just saying that it's one which is working probably more than more linear narratives, and I think the same goes for folklore.
So,
Thank you.
David.
Thanks for the talk, Mattia. And this has been a fun conversation, so thanks to everybody else as well. I have a very specific question. So but a difference between the hermeneutic cycle and spiral that you talked about. So calling it a spiral implies that there's some new direction of motion that's happening, that like we're progressing along some new factor. What is that factor? Like as we go inward on the spiral, what is changing?
I think our understanding of the representation itself is changing.
Okay.
But maybe Noam would be the one who could explain it better because it's his concept. So I don't want to talk for others.
Hi. I recently realized that I reinvented the spiral for at least the third time in history. Because even such a great hermeneutician as Paul Ricoeur has called to use a spiral metaphor rather than a circle, because and that is indeed the reason I use a spiral rather than a circle. Your interpretation, a circle implies that you are going back to the same text every time you're going back to it. But if you come to it with a new understanding every time, then it's no longer the same text. It's no longer the same text cognitively in the case of a written text, but it's really materially so in the case of interactive digital narratives, which are actually altered by you playing them again. So every replay produces a different version. It's not the same text. So even for that reason alone, it would be a spiral because it's not the same text you're returning to, so it can't be a circle. But then again, the area of time, Mattia, I guess, imagined it as having a center that leads you to a complete understanding. I don't think a complete understanding is necessary, but there is definitely a direction towards a broader, richer, thicker understanding of a complexity. I'm not saying, I'm not saying this understanding is exhaustive of the phenomena that's being represented, because I don't think that complex topics can adequately be represented as something that can ever be closed.
Yeah, that's why I was calling it a theoretical center, because exactly for this. But thanks, Noam, and thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks for your answers.
Oh, indeed. Thank to all of you. I'm almost sorry we have to finish this first part of the session, but so let's take a small 10 minutes break and come back at 8:18 and and then we will have our second session. So just stay here and you can get some coffee or tea, and yes, we